Lesson 9, we're going to break up into two parts, so it's all focusing on operations of real numbers. But for the first part, we're just going to focus on addition and subtraction, and then the second part of the lesson will focus on multiplication and division of real numbers. So when we say real numbers, remember we're talking about any numbers that we've seen so far, so basically anything except for complex numbers and imaginary numbers. So we've talked about how to deal with decimals, we've talked about how to deal with fractions, but now we're focusing on what happens with those positive and negative numbers. So when we're adding, if they have the same sign, we're just adding the absolute values of the numbers and we're going to keep that sign between them. So absolute values, remember, just mean the positive of the number. Different sign means we're going to subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger absolute value, and then we're always going to keep the sign of the bigger absolute value number. So let's look at examples of this. So number 1, we have 3 plus negative 4. So when I'm looking at 3 plus negative 4, I'm looking at this as different signs, so I'm going to subtract the smaller absolute value from the larger. So when I'm looking at absolute values, I'm just looking at the 4 and the 3. I'm not looking at the negatives. So really what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to be doing 4 minus 3, which is giving me a 1. So I'm subtracting the difference between the two. And then I keep the sign of the larger number. The larger number, or larger absolute value, is 4, so I'm going to keep the negative because the 4 is negative. So that's it for that one. On a number line, to kind of visually show you what this means. So if I had a number line and I had, let's say, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'm going to go negative 1, negative 2, negative 3. So if I wanted to start, we would always start at 0. And if I have 3, I would be going 1, 2, 3. And if you're subtracting 4, that means I'm going to the left 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, I end up at negative 1. So that's basically how it works on a number line. Let's look at some other examples so to show you. So if we have negative 3 plus 4. So different signs, so subtract the values, you get 1, and then look at the larger number. The larger number is 4, it has a positive, so this is going to be positive 1. What if we have negative 3 plus negative 4? So now it's the same sign, so we just add the two numbers, so we get 7. Keep the sign, which is negative 7. And then, of course, the other combination of this would just be 3, positive 3 plus positive 4. Same sign, add them, keep the sign, so it's positive 7. So those are your different combinations for addition. Now when you think of subtraction, subtraction is basically the same thing as addition. The only difference is you want to think of it as you're adding its opposite. So I'm going to write for subtraction, we're just going to add its opposite. So what that means is A minus B is the same thing as thinking of A plus negative B. So I'm adding the opposite. Some of you have learned this as keep, change, change. So A minus B, you're keeping the first A, you're changing the sign to plus, and then you're changing the sign of B to negative. So it's just adding its opposite. If you think of it this way, then really you're not learning a new set of rules, you're just applying addition one extra step. So basically, if you had 7 minus 2, we know that that equals 5. You can also think of this as keep, change, change. So I'm changing the sign to addition, changing the sign of the positive 2 to negative 2. Then when you're adding, you have opposite signs. So you subtract, you keep the sign of the bigger number, you just get positive 5. So that seems probably kind of silly because it's like, why would you do that when it's just 7 minus 2, you know is 5. But the reason why I wanted to show you is because what happens if you have an example like this where it's negative 7 minus 2. This is the same exact thing as thinking of negative 7 plus negative 2. You're just adding the opposite. So instead of subtracting off 2, you're adding a negative 2. So then, same sign, so you go ahead and add them, and then you just keep the sign. So you get negative 9. So if we have an example of 7 minus negative 2, again, you keep, change, change. So you keep the first, change the sign, change. So it's 7 plus 2. You're adding the opposite. Whenever you're subtracting, you're adding the opposite number. So we get 9. So 2 minus 7. Again, same thing as saying 2 plus negative 7. I'm just adding the negative. Basically, I kind of think of it as like you're just putting a plus sign in between the two terms. So all of these examples, I'm really just putting a little plus sign in between all of them. Okay, and whenever it's a negative minus a negative, it just becomes plus. So there's a couple of ways you can think of it. So we have 2, so back to number 4, 2 plus negative 7. Opposite signs, subtract them. So 7 minus 2 gives me 5. Keep the sign of the bigger absolute value. So we have negative 5 because the 7 was negative. And then let's look at one last example. So negative 8 plus 2 plus negative 5 plus negative 1. So this example is kind of incorporating what you're learning here as well as order of operations. So order of operations, we have to work inside those parentheses first. So I'm going to keep that negative 8. Inside of parentheses, we do 2 minus or 2 plus negative 5. So opposite signs, you're going to subtract. We get 3. Bigger number is 5, so you keep the negative. Plus negative 1. Now it's all addition, so we work left to right. So negative 8 plus negative 3. When we're doing this, same sign, add the number, keep the sign. Plus negative 1. Same sign, add them, keep the sign. Negative 12. Okay, so that's it for adding and subtracting.